I smelled it before I saw the paper, old, dry, almost sweet like ashes and perfume. It lay under my front door, silent as dust. No stamp, no return address. Just one word handwritten in tight cursive that scraped something deep in my chest, Junia. The moment I touched it, the hair on my arms lifted. I opened it slowly, breath caught the house, held its breath with me. Inside one line. I watched you burn. My fingers went cold. My knees buckled. The man who wrote that, he died in a fire. 20 years ago. Where in the world are you listening from? If you feel that chill in your spine, hit subscribe. This story only gets darker from here. We lived in a house that creaked. The wood floors sighed when you stepped on them, even gently. The kitchen faucet clicked at night, and the roof always leaked when it rained. Ashmore sat on the edge of the pines where fog clung to trees like breath. It smelled like wet bark and smoke, the kind of place you could disappear in without anyone noticing. I thought I loved that, back then. Emory taught art at the high school. Charcoal on his sleeves, turpentine on his fingers. He said the world needed more beauty, but he stopped painting after Caleb was born. Too busy with life, he'd shrug. Then he'd pour coffee, always 2 sugars, and never say more. Our son Caleb was 10 when it happened, big-eyed, quiet, liked to build strange little things with wires and tape. He once made a lamp from soup cans and a broken clock radio. Still works. It lives on my bookshelf. We weren't the perfect family, but we had routines. Friday lasagna, Sunday morning walks, late-night cocoa in chipped mugs. Mine had a faded sunflower. His just said, "Teacher." We didn't fight much, or maybe we just stopped talking. Emory had been different, distant. He started staying up late, said he was grading, but the papers stayed untouched. Sometimes I'd hear floorboards creak beneath me. He was always in the basement. Never said why. One night I followed the sound. I stood at the top of the stairs, holding my breath. The air smelled like dust and warm wires. I called down. Nothing. That silence told me more than words ever could. And then came the fire. It was raining, not lightning, not thunder, just a steady downpour and the hum of wind through the trees. I was asleep when the smoke woke me, thick, choking. It tasted like burnt plastic and old dreams. I ran to Caleb's room first. He was coughing, scared, barefoot. We crawled through the hallway. I remember touching the wall. It burned. We made it outside. Neighbors were screaming. Flames bloomed from the back of the house near the basement. "Where's Emory?" That's what they kept asking. "Where's Emory?" But he never came out. The fire chief found pieces of his belt buckle in the ashes. That was all. They said he must have passed out from the smoke, that the fire spread too fast. No one could have survived. We buried an empty box. The coffin felt heavier than the truth. But what else could I believe? Until now. Because 20 years later, someone wrote me a birthday card, with his handwriting, and said I watched you burn. And suddenly I couldn't remember if he ever really died at all. I didn't tell Caleb about the card. Not yet. What would I say? That a ghost remembered my birthday. I kept it tucked inside an old cookbook, the one with stained pages and Emory's name scribbled on the inside cover. I hadn't opened it in years. Now it pulsed every time I walked past the shelf. At night, the silence pressed harder. The wind scraped tree limbs across the roof like fingernails. I lit candles, told myself it was for the scent. But it wasn't. It was for the warmth. The kind that chased shadows away. On Tuesday, I went to the garage. I told myself I needed tools. But what I really wanted was his box. It sat behind old paint cans and rusted folding chairs, untouched, undisturbed. The label still read, "Ease Study." I carried it inside, set it on the table, felt my hands tremble as I opened the lid. The scent hit me first, old ink wood polish, and something sour beneath it all, like paper that had absorbed too many secrets. Inside were notes, sketches, receipts. His old teaching badge. But wedged between a broken compass and dried-out pens was a notebook I didn't recognize. Not worn, not aged, newer. The first few pages were empty, but then about halfway in, a line of writing. Black ink, heavy hand. Mill Creek CO 38.6 Harbor N 12698 fights fire to W ask for Evan. I read it 3 times. The handwriting wasn't old. It wasn't faded. And it sure as hell wasn't from before the fire. My throat tightened. My fingers ran over the letters. Still damp, still real. Someone had touched this recently. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed the card from the cookbook, held them side by side. The slant, the looped A, the curved tail of the Y at the end of burn. Identical. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't imagining ghosts. He had written that card, and now he had a new name, a new place, a new life. And for the first time in 20 years, I stopped mourning and started wondering, where the hell is Mill Creek, and what else did he fake? The basement door stuck like it didn't want to be opened. The wood groaned as I pulled it. Dust swirled in the air, tasted like rust and old silence. My flashlight flickered. Of course it did. I hadn't been down here in years. Maybe once, to store Christmas boxes. Maybe. But Emory used to live in this space. Every night before the fire, he'd vanish down here for hours. Said he was organizing sorting cleaning. I never asked why. The first step creaked. So did the second. By the third, I couldn't hear anything else over my own heartbeat. It smelled like earth and mildew, like something wet had been left too long. The air was cold, not just chilly, cold like breathless. The beam from my flashlight slid over boxes, tarps, spiderwebs, and then paused. Something glinted beneath a sagging shelf in a shallow metal tray. Something small, something silver. I reached for it. My fingers brushed soft ash. I held it up. A necklace. My necklace. The oval pendant, once polished gold, now dulled and blackened on one side. The chain twisted in knots, partially melted. I knew that piece. Knew it like my own skin. Emory gave it to me on our 10th anniversary. He called it a charm to keep fire away. We laughed. It broke a week later, the clasp, and he fixed it himself in the garage. After the fire, the coroner gave me his ring and charred belt buckle. I asked about the necklace. They said it likely melted, disappeared. But it hadn't. It lived down here, hidden. The basement swallowed sound. Even as my breath caught, the room didn't echo. It absorbed everything like it had been waiting. I ran my thumb over the burned metal. Sharp, it nicked me. A tiny bead of blood rose, warm, alive. I staggered back. Suddenly the air felt thick. The walls closer. He left this, intentionally, as if part of him never really left. As if the fire wasn't meant to end him, but to erase something else. The flashlight flickered again. I shut it off, stood in the dark, and whispered into the silence. What were you doing down here, Emory? There was no answer, just the sound of a single water droplet falling somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. I told myself not to involve Caleb, but that choice never really belonged to me. He called that evening, his voice sharp, almost breathless. Mom, do you remember Dad's nose? I blinked. What kind of question is that? His nose, Caleb repeated. That weird bend, the way it pulled left after he broke it skiing. Of course, I could picture it now. The slight crook just under the bridge. He always hated it. Said it made him look unfinished. Caleb paused. Can you open your laptop? That chill returned. I moved to the kitchen. The overhead light hummed, flickering. I sat down and clicked the browser. He sent a link, a TikTok video, 32 seconds long. Some woman filming her dog playing in a snowy park. Just watch the background, Caleb said. I did. At first, nothing. Just trees, snow, the sound of barking. Then a flash of motion. A man walking past in the distance. Dark coat, blue scarf, pushing a stroller. I paused the frame, zoomed in. The angle was grainy, but the nose, that nose. Even blurry, it bent the same way. The jawline too. Square, tight. He turned slightly, glancing toward the dog. My stomach dropped. His eyes, they weren't looking at the camera, not directly, but for a moment, just a flicker. It felt like he saw me. I swallowed hard. Where was this taken, I asked. Mill Creek, Caleb replied. Colorado. My blood ran cold. He went quiet, then added softly, I thought I was crazy. But I matched the timestamp. That clip was filmed 2 weeks ago. I leaned back in the chair. The kitchen faded around me. The scent of burnt coffee lingered from the morning. I hadn't even noticed. He's alive, Caleb said. Not a question, not fear, just fact. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I think I said slowly, we were never meant to know. Caleb took a breath. He didn't just leave us, Mom. No, I touched the screen, traced the frozen frame. He replaced us. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. Every board, every hinge, carried someone else's secrets. I waited until night, when Caleb went home, when the wind covered my steps. Then I went back to the basement. The flashlight beam skimmed across shadows. I moved the shelf. The old workbench creaked, and under it something odd. A crack in the floorboards. I dropped to my knees, ran my fingers along the wood. There, a seam, just wide enough to wedge a butter knife in. I pried it open. Dust rose. The scent hit hard like old metal and engine oil. Buried inside, a small green tin, scratched, locked. I carried it upstairs, set it on the table, stared at it under the kitchen light. Then I opened the drawer, found Emory's old screwdriver, and jammed it in. The lid popped. Inside papers, photos, receipts, a folded map, and at the bottom a burner phone cracked but intact. I pulled the map first. Red ink circled 3 towns, one of them Mill Creek. Next, an airline ticket. One way, Seattle to Denver, dated 4 days before the fire. My hands shook. I dug deeper. A photo, me and Caleb at the county fair. He was 11. But I never saw that photo taken. We were in line. I was holding a soda, laughing. The angle came from across the crowd, behind a fence. I pulled another, same story. Me at the grocery store, carrying apples, looking tired. The timestamp said 2011. I dropped it, stepped back. The kitchen spun. He hadn't just started over. He watched us, for years. Like we were his unfinished story. A side plot he could visit, but never rejoin. The receipts told their own tale, motel stays, gas stations, all within driving distance of Ashmore. He was nearby. While I grieved, while Caleb cried, he watched. I sat down, hands in my lap. In that moment, grief became something else. It sharpened, calcified, turned to resolve. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't broken. I had evidence, proof, and now I had a reason to act. I didn't leave a note, didn't pack a bag. I just grabbed the keys and drove. Mill Creek sat 4 hours east, through canyons and pine valleys. The road twisted like memory, beautiful but full of drop-offs. The farther I got, the less afraid I felt. Something inside me had already crossed a line. I thought of the night before the fire, how Emory looked at me. His eyes flat mouthed still, not angry, not distant, empty. He kissed my forehead before bed, but his lips were cold, like he'd already left. The mountains rose in the distance. My hands gripped the wheel. In the passenger seat, the green tin. I brought it with me. Every photo, every receipt, every map folded tight. I needed to see him, not for answers, but for closure. I pulled into a small overlook, cut the engine. The air smelled like pine and snowmelt. Sharp, clean. Below, the town spilled quiet along the river. Cabins, playgrounds, children's laughter drifting faintly in the breeze. He was down there, living, laughing, like we'd never burned. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't ask why. I whispered, "Now you'll see what it feels like to be haunted." I didn't go to the police, not yet. What would I even say? He faked his death. Here's a necklace and a map. They'd file it under unsolvable and move on. No, this had to be done right, on my terms. The first thing I did was make copies. Every document, every photo. I scanned and labeled them on an old laptop Emory never touched. I named the folder House Repairs, just in case. Next, I printed a second set, placed them in a plain brown envelope, and hid it under the floorboard in the guest room. The one he always hated. Said the wallpaper gave him headaches. Then I looked for help. Not the dramatic kind. No trench coat, no stakeouts. I found a woman named Denise, private investigator, office in a strip mall beside a nail salon. She didn't flinch when I handed her the green tin. Just asked, "What do you need?" "I want to know where he lives, what name he uses, who he's pretending to be." She tapped her pen. "You want a confrontation?" "No," I said. "I want the truth documented. Quietly." She nodded. "You'll have it in 10 days. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of cinnamon from the bakery down the block. And I felt steady. Each night I slept deeper. The nightmares faded. I even started baking again. Peach bread, lemon shortbread. The kind he used to love, but never thanked me for. I made more copies. This time mailed them. No return address. Just a padded envelope to 1 Hethesa Marwood, Mill Creek, Colorado. Inside, I included 3 things. A photo of Emory and I on our wedding day, a burned pendant, and 1 line typed on old paper, "You deserve to know who sleeps beside you." No threats, no names. Let the silence speak for me. Days passed, nothing. Then on the 4th night, the cameras blinked. I'd set them up the same day I returned from Mill Creek. 2 cheap ones, one over the driveway, one angled toward the mailbox. At 2:12 a.m., A tall figure approached the gate. Black coat, ball cap pulled low. He didn't knock, didn't speak. He just stared at the house for nearly 8 minutes, and then walked away. I watched the footage 3 times, frame by frame. The way he moved, like someone rehearsing a memory. He knew where to step, which board creaked, which didn't. I knew that walk. Emory? I didn't tell Caleb. Not yet. He'd done enough, found that first video, pulled the thread loose. But this next part, it had to come from me. I printed one of the old photos, the one Emory took of me and Caleb at the fair. The corner still burned, a blur of ash near Caleb's elbow. On the back I wrote "Still watching." Then I slipped it into an envelope. No return address, just one word typed on the front. Evan. I mailed it to a post office near Mill Creek, not to his house, not to his name, but to a mailbox I'd found buried in his receipts. The same box he used to send money orders, every month. He'd receive it, he'd know. Days passed, I waited. The bakery smelled like apples that week. I sat at the window each morning, mug in hand, scarf wrapped tight. The wind had shifted, spring was crawling in, and then at 6:42 p.m. on a Thursday, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, no caller ID. I let it ring out. It called again, and again. The 4th time I answered. Silence. Then a breath, and one word. Why? I didn't reply. I let the line hang like he had all those years. Then I whispered, "You watched me burn," and ended the call. That night I left the porch light on. It rained, thin and steady, like ash falling backward. At 11:08 p.m. he appeared. Not at the door, at the edge of the garden, standing between the rosemary and the rosebush. I watched from the hallway, curtain barely pulled. He didn't move, didn't try the door, just looked at the window, like he could see through the years, the dust, the grief. And for the first time, he looked afraid. I didn't open the door, didn't speak. I let him feel it, that helpless, breathless weight he once left on my chest. When I buried an empty coffin, when Caleb asked where his father went, when I sat on the kitchen floor holding a burned mug and a lie, now he stood there, dripping, cold, not dead, but exposed. And still I wasn't done, because truth deserved an audience, and pain deserved a witness. I picked up the green tin from the mantel, placed it by the door, taped a note to the top. Take it, read it, then decide how much more you want to lose. He never knocked. But when I opened the door the next morning, the tin was gone. The only thing left, a single footprint in the mud, pointed away from the house. He didn't reply for 3 days. No calls, no letters, no knocks. But I knew better. Cowards wait until they think you've softened. Then they show up like nothing happened. So I gave him a time, a place. Typed on a single sheet of paper, Saturday noon. Valley Creek Park. I left it at the motel he'd stayed in during that stormy night. Front desk clerk tucked it into room 103. He'd find it, and if he didn't, that told me all I needed to know. Saturday came cold and gray. The trees stood bare, their branches like nerves against the sky. I wore black, not for mourning, for memory. I sat on the bench farthest from the path. The wind carried wood smoke. A dog barked in the distance. Then I saw him, same height, thinner, hair mostly white now. He walked like someone approaching a grave, careful, guilty. I didn't stand. He sat 2 feet between us, but it felt like years. His voice cracked first. I don't know how to start. You already did, I said, 20 years ago, with fire. He looked down. I was drowning, Junia. I couldn't breathe. I thought. You thought I wouldn't survive without you, I cut in. No, you hoped I would, so you could forget us clean. He shook his head. I watched from afar. You were strong. Don't you dare make this flattering. I turned. His eyes flinched. I buried a ghost. I raised a son without answers. You stalked us from motel parking lots, like a man watching a play he abandoned. He said nothing, and then Caleb stepped into view. He hadn't told me he was coming, but I wasn't surprised. He walked toward us steady, anger tight in his jaw. Emory stood startled. Caleb? Don't, Caleb's voice cut like ice. You don't get to use my name. A pause, long, silent, heavy. Do you know what I remember most? Caleb asked. Emory shook his head unsure. That year after you vanished. Mom didn't cry out loud. She just folded every towel twice. Kept all the lights on. He looked at me. I nodded. I couldn't fix the silence, I said. But I refused to let him shape it. Caleb turned to his father. You left her in the ashes, and you left me in the dark. Emory's shoulders sagged. No words came. Finally, he reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, offered it. Caleb stepped back, didn't take it. I reached forward, unfolded it, read it once, then tore it in half, let the wind take the pieces. Closure, I said, is not something you hand us. It's what we take back. I stood. The clouds broke for a second. A sliver of sun hit the side of my face. Caleb joined me. Emory didn't follow. He stayed seated, alone, small, shrinking into the bench like a man watching his own erasure. I didn't look back, not once. And when we got home, I threw away the green tin, not because I forgot, but because I no longer needed to remember. Spring came late that year. The lavender bloomed crooked, but it bloomed. I started spending mornings in the garden again, coffee in one hand, hope in the other. Caleb came by more often. He never mentioned Emory. Didn't need to. Some truths don't ask for retelling. They just settle in. Quiet. Permanent. One afternoon, I opened the box of old letters I used to keep. Birthday cards, thank you notes. His handwriting looped exacting, full of pretend. I burned every last one. Not from hate, from freedom. I wrote a new letter that day. Not to him. To her, the woman I used to be. You survived, I wrote. He vanished. But you stood in the ashes and grew roots. Then I sealed it, placed it in the garden soil under the new rosemary bush. Some memories deserve to rest. The porch light doesn't stay on at night anymore. I turn it off, I lock the door, and I sleep. Deep, dreamless, whole. Have you ever mistaken silence for peace? Have you ever lived next to a ghost and didn't know it? Tell me where in the world you're listening from. Because if you've made it this far, you understand. And if you know someone who's still haunted, send this story to them. Let them hear it, let them feel it. And subscribe, because more stories are waiting in the dark, just like this one. But I've already stepped into the light.